Welcome to the fourth episode of this podcast on body politics in the 21st century. The Cambridge Centre for International Research has given me the great and demanding task of exploring what we do to our bodies, why we do it, and who gets to decide what is beautiful, healthy, or wrong about them. And in the 6 episodes of this podcast, I would explore topics ranging from body positivity, self-tracking, plastic surgery, and much more. And for each episode, I welcome a different expert and we chat about the politics of bodies in our contemporary world. And today I'm delighted to welcome Professor Sarah Banet-Weiser, who is Professor of Media and Communications and Head of Department of Media and Communications at LSE. Sarah's done extensive research in gender and media and consumer culture in popular media. And in 2018, she published her latest book, Empowered: Popular Feminism and Popular Misogyny. And for today's episode, we'll talk a lot about this book and her adjacent research, and I will question her about the kind of feminism which has taken over popular culture in the past years, the backlash this has entailed, and what all this has to do with neoliberal market economics. Welcome, Sarah, and thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with just introducing our viewers and listeners to your recent book, Empowered. And you look at popular feminism and its backlash in the form of misogyny. What inspired you to write about it? What were the kind of changes you noticed in popular media which you felt needed to be written about?
Yeah, there are a couple of kind of things happening culturally that inspired me to write this book. One is just as a someone who teaches about popular culture and someone who also participates in popular culture, I started just noticing, more and more messages about feminism. And in my career, where I've taught classes on gender and media for 20 years, the difference in my students and how my students were embracing the concept of feminism rather than rejecting it or repudiating it was a significant difference. And so thinking about over the trajectory of teaching, where students were, the very familiar, I'm not a feminist, but I believe in equal rights and that kind of thing, but really rejecting the identity category of feminist, to my students asking me how they can organize feminist groups on campus, to being much more outspoken about embracing it. That was a significant change, and one that actually I was super excited about, right? Because it just seemed that there was more public awareness about gender inequalities, about misogyny, and about some of the kind of broader goals and aims of feminism. The other kind of thing that inspired me to write about this is in my earlier work, when I was writing about brand culture, that book came out in 2012, and I was just really exploring the kind of the mechanisms that people were using to develop a self-brand on social media, because it was 2012, right? So I was talked about Facebook and YouTube a little bit, and especially young girls or young women and girls on YouTube, and what it meant to put themselves on display on a global site for display, and how that was also about building this thing called a self-brand, which is now, as we know, completely normative. No one questions it. It is, in fact, the career trajectory for young people, is build a self-brand, become an influencer, So the kind of uptick in social media and the ways in which messages of feminism were so much more rapidly circulated and made visible, made me, kind of inspired me to write this. And a third reason is personal. I've told this story before, which is, in 2014, I was watching the MTV's Video Music Awards with my daughter, who was then 13, who was beginning to be part of this demographic that was targeted by feminism, right? And we watched Beyonce, sing Flawless with, feminist lit up behind her. And my daughter was like, hey, look, Beyonce's talking about your work, and there's this kind of recognition of feminism as something that was popular, that was associated with an incredibly global pop singer like Beyonce. That connection was really interesting to me, and I wanted to kind of figure out what it meant.
I mean, I think the Beyonce example is so fascinating because, of course, like I remember, her in the MTV Awards, and I talked to someone from the US a couple of days ago, and we were talking about Prince Philip, dying recently, and they said how unprepared they were for the kind of reverence there still is to the royal family in the UK when they came here. And for them, if someone had asked them in the US, like who's the queen, they would have seen, Queen Bee. And this is, the kind of level someone like Beyonce has reached in popular culture, and with it, of course, her message of feminism and female empowerment, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, Beyonce is, probably, the one of the closest things that, the Americans have to royalty. I mean, they place their kind of affective investments, not in a royal family, but in these major influential celebrities. And so, and Beyonce has, continued this message of feminism since 2014 with Lemonade and Homecoming and all the different ways in which she has, kind of expressed this this idea of female empowerment. That's been really important, right? As for public awareness.
So you say in the book that different kinds of feminism compete for popularity, and that popularity is a struggle in itself. So different things struggle for popularity in the first place. How do we differentiate the different feminisms that compete? Because you might think, feminism is just this one sort of way to look at the world. It's just that women and men should be treated equally. What kind of different feminisms are there that struggle for popularity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, first of all, I take this idea of popular culture being a terrain of struggle from the social theorist Stuart Hall, who talked about the ways in which there were different sorts of populars in culture, right? And that because culture is about dynamics of power, they compete for dominance, these different kind of populars. And so the question really becomes, what do you need in order to be the most popular, right? What do you need in order to be the most visible? And so, one of the arguments I'm making in the book is yes, we can differentiate between different feminisms. This broad idea that it's about equality between genders is also a political idea, one that is based in a particular definition of what equality means, right? That is often about rights discourse. It's often about a liberal subject, a sort of this idea, this fantasy of a level playing field, of an equal playing field. But that is an idea, that kind of feminism, that it's a broad understanding about equality, is one that gets a lot of visibility. It's palatable. It's easy to digest. Yeah. It's not particularly alienating, right? I mean, to say equality, we want equality is not, I mean, it has been a revolutionary idea for sure. But in this moment, in this cultural moment, it's not necessarily like a controversial idea, right? To say, and in fact, popular feminism makes this point, that we're not being controversial. We're just saying we want equal rights. Yeah. Well, one of the problems with equal rights and this kind of universalizing feminism is, of course, it excludes all sorts of different kinds of women and different kinds of men, different kinds of people. So to say that it's about gender equality, and this is well documented, right, means that, the particular ways in which women of color are also targets of racism, what Moya Bailey calls misogynoir, right? Both misogyny and racism, that is erased in that kind of universal, here's our big goal. And it's not only that is erased, but those women are erased from the larger goals of feminism. And again, this has been well documented. And so one of the things that I was trying to explore in this book is what is the relationship between social media and multiple media platforms, and how a particular definition of feminism was able to circulate and gain visibility, and which by, in the way that visibility works, necessarily put other feminisms into the shadows, right? Obscured other feminisms. And what does that mean for feminism in terms of a kind of liberatory movement or having goals of liberation?
I mean, I think just thinking about popularity as such is interesting because, I mean, as you say in the book as well, and I guess as has been really popular or common to speak about in social media, is, we consume in these kind of bubbles, right? So we might be deceived about what's really popular because it might just be popular in the kind of left liberal bubble that I consume on social media, say. And then sometimes you get shocked or you realize that you are in this bubble because you see, the Twitter threads full of misogyny, or Kate Mann, she publicizes the kind of emails she gets in response to her books, death threats and this kind of stuff. And you get reminded that what's popular for your social media bubble, right, it can be really different for what's popular for someone else's bubble, I take it. Why do you think it seems like there's always this hostile backlash of misogyny following some kind of feminist pushing through or becoming more popular? Why is it that feminism becoming more popular seems to also make misogyny more popular?
And it turns out, like, I started writing this book as a book on popular feminism, right? I was looking at confidence organizations for girls. I was looking at social media messages and celebrity messages, like the Beyonce example that we talked about before, but also things like Tumblr pages that, included inspirational thoughts like "you're beautiful, you're confident, you got this," that kind of thing. And this whole market, what I've talked about in the book, is a market for self-esteem. That's what I was initially interested in. But as I write about in the book, every time that I started to do a deeper dive into the research in those kinds of expressions and practices of feminism, of popular feminism, there was always a hostile response, right? And this was happening in a kind of cultural conjuncture, right? At the same time, it was happening at the same time as the extreme right was gaining more and more visibility and utilizing social media channels to organize, to radicalize, to, to spread a kind of different kind of message. It's at the moment when you have heads of state in various countries either win a position as head of state, like Trump or Bolsonaro, but also just as being kind of, having a certain number, a percentage of votes that we haven't seen in a long time, like in France and in Germany and, and the Netherlands. And so this was happening at the same time. And so I wanted to kind of think about these things in relationship to each other. And so what I did in the book is actually say, that in order for us to understand popular feminism, we have to take into account the relationship with popular misogyny. And to your question, why do I think this is? I mean, there is a, there's a kind of patriarchal hegemony, right? And I'm looking in the book mainly in the West, although patriarchal hegemony is not just located in the West. But anytime that is seen to be under threat, there's a very defensive and increasingly hostile reaction, right? Feminism threatens patriarchy, right? It says that is one of its goals, is to challenge it, or as you see on mugs and t-shirts, to smash it, right? And so anytime that feminism becomes more visible and more palatable and more accepted by different people, you have this kind of hostile reaction. And in a moment when there's other discourses of economic precarity, of feeling like you're not being represented anymore, all these things especially by white men, feminism poses a particular threat. And so one of the things I was also interested in the book is thinking about, you know, what are some of the reasons why women in general and feminists in particular were the targets of blame for everything, for economic precarity, for, you know, for everything, right? So why not greed? Why not capitalism? Why not the banks, right? And so, you know, thinking about this idea of feminism becoming or being a serious threat. And you can see it in all of the message boards, you know, and all of this stuff that I've talked about. Men's rights organizations, men's rights activism are so often target feminism as the cause of all despair. Right. And so that relationship, I think, is really crucial for us to acknowledge and try to understand if we're going to see how feminism might actually, you know, what kind of future feminism will have.
I think you're right and I think it's actually really important and interesting to look at how early on in sort of the internet age, the right and political parties and political organizations on the right wing managed to figure out how to be visible on social media. And I think it's actually really interesting how early on they understood the power of something like hashtags and threads, and how they were able to amplify each other's voices, and really early on hacked this idea of the algorithm on social media. And you have a focus in the book on this idea of visibility and what its relation is to popular feminism. Could you just explain a little bit more why focus on visibility and what it maybe has to do with this kind of algorithm on social media I talked about? So figuring out how to become visible and consumed and clicked on.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and there's different sort of points of entry to the answer to that question. I mean, one of them is just a general, you know, kind of attention economy context, right? That if you know, as we participate more and more on social media, as things like followers and likes and friends, you know, on Facebook become somehow metrics, somehow an index of how you matter. Right? How you can recognize yourself, how you are significant in the world, right? This kind of becomes this cycle of visibility, or again, what the media scholar Herman Gray has called, you know, the struggle for recognition. We want to recognize ourselves, right? And social media provides us with this unbelievable way to do so, right? That we hadn't experienced before. So visibility is really, really important in that sense, because in a cultural context and in which if we can recognize ourselves, if we can see ourselves, then we matter, right? Then visibility absolutely matters, right? It you know, and so my point there is not that visibility itself is a problem, but what happens then, also because of the rapid circulation of social media, the ways in which information has to be distilled, has to be reduced to a particular kind of content, that visibility ends up becoming an end in itself, right? So that the retweet is the politics, the circulation is the politics, and so one of the issues of or elements of visibility, what I call in an economy of visibility, is precisely that, the ways in which multiple media platforms amplify particular voices, make them visible, or images, make them visible at the expense of others, right? And so that's part of it. The other part of it is also about the design of social media itself, that it is, you know, what you had said earlier about echo chambers and that kind of thing. You know, the design of, and lots of people have done really important work on this, you know, people like Sophia Noble and Simone Brown and Ruha Benjamin, about how it is that racism, for example, is baked in to the algorithm, baked into technology. And so particular images, as Noble points out, of Black women become visible, right? And those images are damaging and hypersexualized and racist, right? And so that the ways in which visibility is, as people have said, talked about it as, is a trap, right? That it both gives you validation in a mediated world, but it also is about surveillance and judgment and scrutiny. And those two things collide, I think, and which is one of the reasons why I think visibility becomes an end in itself for popular feminism, where wearing the t-shirt means that I'm practicing feminist politics, right? And that's all I have to do, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I found that the example of the t-shirt, you know, something like empowered, or this is what a feminist looks like, the kind of examples you have in the book, really convincing. And when you mentioned this, it really came to me what you mean by visibility, you know, being an end in itself. The politics is just wearing the t-shirt. There's nothing further to be achieved by it. It's just, you have done the politics simply by making the statement visible. So you mentioned surveillance already. So what can be harmful about having visibility, you know, as an end in itself? What are the kind of dangers?
I mean, there's lots of them, right? I mean, and lots of them, women have been subject to, you know, for centuries, right? So, you know, when you're talking also about social media platforms that are image-based, whether that be Instagram or TikTok or Twitter, you know, which is also image-based, right? You know, you know, as always happens with representations of women, women's bodies are shamed, they're judged, they're scrutinized, they're humiliated, they're objectified, they're hypersexualized, right? So visibility comes with all that if you're using social media forms, right? If you're, you know, and and you can see this, you know, with influencers very easily, like the ways in which female influencers are shamed for their bodies compared to the ways in which male influencers are shamed, if they are, right? Now, I'm not saying that they're not, but they're not shamed for how they look, right? And this is a very old and deeply sedimented, you know, practice of judging and evaluating women based on their bodies, right? And so that doesn't change in social media; it's amplified in social media. There's also the surveillance, though, that comes with, you know, the fact that you know, we can see this with Black Lives Matter. We can see this with the ways in which communities of color are put under intense scrutiny and surveillance by the state, by the police, you know, so that, you know, you are stopped while driving, when driving while Black, right? As this thing goes, you know, that you are the subject of scrutiny, the subject of surveillance. And that is also, we see this with trans people, all the kind of stuff about, where and what spaces trans people are in, able, kind of accepted in, is about surveillance, right? And it's about visibility. It's once this particular identity category becomes more visible, it comes with it, especially if you're marginalized in a marginalized community, it comes with extra surveillance. And so that's why we can't just talk about, the attention economy and those kind of how-to business, how to become an influencer. It's like, get yourself out there, put yourself out there, become more visible, without ever acknowledging what happens when you do that, and what you are subjecting yourself to when you do that, and how that is different for different bodies.
Yeah. I mean, I could do, I think I should highlight to anyone who views this, I've talked to Deborah Lupton in an earlier episode about one specific example of this, which is Stephanie Buttermore and her approach to food and her food diaries, and how this was supposed to bring out this idea that you can just eat what you want and still look just as thin and just as muscular as before. And it's this kind of fantasy that she wanted to combine like this excess with discipline. And she, we spoke about how she later acknowledged that this was a fantasy. It never worked like that. There was extreme restriction behind the camera. And she felt that she was put under surveillance and she put herself under surveillance, basically. So if you're interested in that, this episode might be for you as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And then you make the interesting connection, and I think at that part very, very clear suggestion to the reader in the book that there's this just innate connection to marketization of feminism here as well, and to a neoliberal market which uses this popular feminism, and that this can be problematic because it looks at feminism and especially empowerment for individual girls more than groups or the gender as such. And it's of course commodified and sold through products. Can you just give a couple of examples for us which make this connection between the kind of popular feminism and marketization clear?
Sure. I think one example that I can give actually relates to the previous comment about kind of, you know, food and eating and diet regimes online and on social media. And that is the kind of body, and I think you've probably talked about it in other episodes of this podcast, body positivity movement, right? This like love your body movement. So ostensibly, you know, the love your body movement or body positivity is actually, you know, encourages us to love our bodies no matter what. Right? We know that that's not true, right? We know that that's not true from all sorts of angles. We know that's not true from fat shaming and slut shaming. We know that that's not true from, you know, things like the ways in which access to healthy food or access to, you know, to nutrition is, you know, and we saw that really kind of come into bold relief in the last year of the pandemic. You know, what these kind of structural and infrastructural limitations and discriminations have to do with bodies, right? How we understand and how our bodies are valued. There's been, the quintessential popular feminist marketization of this is, the example is probably Dove, right? You know, and with their body positivity kind of movement, their fund for self-esteem, their ways in which they are promoting a healthy understanding of the body, except are they, right? And my students have written lots about Dove and how this idea, when they show, and this isn't just Dove, this is lots of different companies, when they show like a range of bodies, that is like a range within such a small parameter, that is still about idealized femininity, that is still about being thin, that is still about not showing signs of labor on your body. You don't have wrinkles, you don't have cellulite, you don't, I mean, this whole recent thing with, controversy with Khloe Kardashian, where, a photo of her of Instagram was released without her permission because she hadn't edited it yet, right? And it showed her body as her body, with whatever it was. I didn't see it, but it was like stretch marks or cellulite or whatever. And this sort of, ways in which this became a controversy, because she wanted to have control of her brand, but having control of her brand meant to edit. So if we're so accepting about everyone's body, why is there an incredible industry of filters and Facetunes and different ways? I mean, not to even mention the diet industry, right? Which is a billion dollar industry, right? I mean, so if we are accepting, why the continual increase in marketing a particular understanding of the body, right? As young, as thin, as typically white, as kind of conventionally attractive by Western standards, right? That is a way in which that becomes a product, right? In terms of the marketization of gender, or what people have called commodity feminism. And feminism, the kind of feminism that becomes visible, then capitalizes on that market and says, no, this is really about inclusivity, when in fact, it's about marketing a particular definition of who and what an ideal woman should be.
I mean, I'm so glad you mentioned Dove, because it reminded me of something I heard just a couple of days ago. And when I heard it, I thought about, upcoming podcasts. I thought I really need to remember to bring this up. And some of the viewers might have heard this as well. So there's this new Spotify ad, and it's by The Body Shop. But it's the first time I heard it. It's this kind of poetry slam style, and it's all about self-love, but it's sets out self-love as this kind of revolutionary movement that we have to do with ourselves, and that it's really revolutionary when you do that as a woman. It just really empowers you, but it's narrated in this really tragic kind of poetry slam way, which is usually, I think, which I associated with these really powerful poetry slams a couple of years ago about rape and abuse, and more recently about racial inequalities. So it was narrated in this really social justice kind of tone of voice, but with this really like washed down message of self-love in it, which just made it, for me at least, really cringe to listen to. And it was so overblown in its open commodification of this really like washed down idea of self-love through buying some Body Shop products, right? But I heard it, and this was just the example I thought from when, having read the book, this is what you were talking about, right?
Yeah, well, okay, so I haven't seen that, but now I will. So I don't know if I'll be thanking you later or not. But yeah, I mean, the idea of self-love is right up there with body positivity and love your body, and self-care and all the rest. And I want to be clear. I mean, it's important for us to have good understandings about ourselves, to have, to accept and feel okay in inhabiting the body we have, and all the rest. It's not that that's the problem. It's that something about self-love puts the burden. It's mainly about women. It puts the burden back on the woman herself in order to figure out how to love herself. And that's what Dove does all the time. These ideas like, that somehow it's us, it's ourselves that tell ourselves that we are not beautiful, that tell ourselves that we are not confident, that don't love ourselves, as if we are not inhabiting a culture, and a way of living that tells us every day in multiple ways that we shouldn't love ourselves, that we shouldn't be confident, that we are less than, that we are, that we are not beautiful. And so by focusing intensely on the individual as the consumer of feminism, rather than on a collective, politics of feminism, or on even the structural ground of racism or sexism, it deflects us, right, from thinking about how to, actually achieve social justice, right, which is social justice is about the social. It's not about the individual, right, and it's about kind of challenging infrastructural and structural patterns of discrimination and hate and power, right? And so but all of these, the way in which the marketing of feminism works is that it understands us to be consumers, and as consumers, you can be in a demographic, but really what corporations and companies are doing is targeting us as individual people who can buy, right? Who can purchase. And so it's about building the brand through these individual consumers. So it's not necessarily, some companies are doing a better job of it, but it's not about actually tackling the structural ground that makes us feel less than in the first place.
I think this is actually really applicable to how climate change has been treated by companies. And I think there's a very similar dynamic going on there, which is, you buy a product and we plant a tree or something like that, right? Or you are the one who needs to consume more sustainably, and not the corporation who, is responsible for much more pollution. I was wondering though, so this kind of happy self-love, empowerment, feminism, and its commodification, how do you think, has this been disrupted by maybe this more severe outrage which followed Me Too, and maybe even more Black Lives Matter, where there was this really active problematization of violence, so real life abuse, rape, violence, death? How did companies or this feel-good feminism square that?
I mean, well, there's some obvious ways in which we saw, we saw like in BLM, especially after George Floyd was murdered, and there was a heightened visibility of Black Lives Matter around the world. We saw corporation after corporation, put out statements on their websites, or a black square on Instagram, or, some kind of commitment, some vague commitment to racial equality, saying, we stand with this, even though the practices of not hiring people of color, of not promoting people of color, of redlining, of being discriminatory in their practices if you're a bank, all that continued, right? And weren't acknowledged as part of that company's identity, right? So it's a way in which, and this is not a new phenomenon, right? That it's a way in which corporations harness a particular politics, especially one that becomes quite visible, and attaches their product to that politics in order to gain a larger demographic, right? And it's always a risk, because, people, and you see this with a company like Nike, right? Who, sponsored Colin Kaepernick in the United States when there was a large scale conservative movement against him as an individual. But Nike also has built their brand on being this kind of company who, stands for particular sort of justice movements. It's also a brand that attracts younger people, right? And so, all these are corporate marketing moves, right? Like how do we not alienate the consumers? Or if we're going to alienate this group, does it matter who has the most spending power? Who do we want to attract? So it's much more about establishing a capitalist relationship between a corporation and a demographic, or a corporation and a consumer, than it is about a corporation being committed to racial justice, right? And so, I think that that's part of it. But the question about how this sort of jars against this idea of like a happy feminism. I mean, Me Too is complicated, right? All these movements are complicated, but Me Too, I've for various reasons have written about a lot, have looked at a lot. And I think that, the best way to characterize how I feel about this is about the movement is ambivalence. I do think that it was really important to have so many stories out there in the world, circulating on social media, gathering momentum, gathering a kind of, an undeniable, right? An undeniable presence. Yeah. This is happening, right? Sexual harassment, sexual assault in the workplace is happening. And it's not just happening in the entertainment industries, it's happening in every industry. Right. And so, I think that Me Too has really been important for other kind of industries to acknowledge, or to feel enabled or authorized to come forward with, their own stories of sexual harassment, like the tech industry, and that kind of thing. So that's been really, really important. I also think, though, that because of the mechanisms of social media, because this is about individual women, coming forward on social media, that it becomes about individuals, and it becomes the cases that become the most visible are typically those that are about white women and white men. Yeah. Right. And so you have individual bad guys, right, who are vilified by social media, and sometimes convicted, and sometimes sent to jail, although not that often. But it becomes about those bad guys, and what the promise and the potential of Me Too is, like, I think what I said before, is that this is normalized in every industry. Yeah. It's not about bad guys, right? It's about the way in which gender and gender dynamics are understood and practiced in culture. And so that, I think that, the mechanisms for forming this kind of movement are already limited by social media platforms. I will say that I've been more impressed with, or I don't know if more impressed is the word, but I have been very bolstered by the ways in which Me Too has encouraged other kinds of movements around the world that are not about social media and not about celebrities, that are about International Women's Day or the, you know, international strike, or, you know, in Latin America, the ways in which so many thousands of women have, you know, have kind of come together to protest things like femicide and discriminatory practices. That, you know, those are the kind of movements that actually I think are quite hopeful. And I don't think they can be separated from Me Too, right? But I think that, you know, our attention should be on that rather than on the mostly white famous celebrities who, you know, come forward. Again, not diminishing their trauma, but just asking ourselves, what is it that you need to have in order for you to be recognized?
This reminds me of, I recently read Susan Bordeaux's book, The Male Body, and she talks about sexual harassment and sexual abuse and how this has been covered in the media. Of course, when she wrote that, very much in the wake of both Clinton and the Anita Thomas debate. And she makes, I think, an observation connected to your point about the vilification of certain men as the bad men, but the exception nonetheless. And she says that whenever any of these sexual harassment or abuse cases came out publicly, there was often in the media this sort of add-on that there was something else sexually deviant about these men. They were already weird in some other way. There was always something to put them in this already like sexually weird sphere, and this is why they did it, putting them out of our normal lives into this what we already find disgusting or weird or abject or something like that. And I thought that was really interesting because I think this is still happening today. So last week, and like former national football player in Germany was convicted of possession of child pornography. And when that was like publicized in the media, there was this, like, with this crime, there was this, the next sentence was, you know, he had already cheated before or had pornographic, like adult material, as if this was relevant to, like, it was just this sexual deviance kind of theme running through, as if you couldn't have done this without in some other way being weird or not in the conservative norm. So yeah, that just, you know, your point about making out the evil guy reminded me of this piece, and I think which is still happening in how we report, you know, sexual harassment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we don't, you know, it's not very common for us to look at these acts of whatever kind of violence you want to talk about, emotional abuse or pornography, you know, the possession of child pornography or assault. We don't, you know, the general feeling is not to attack masculinity.
Yeah.
Right. It's not about what makes up masculinity. It is about, like you said, these kind of lone wolves or deviants, or, you know, people who already had proclivities towards violence, as if masculinity, hegemonic masculinity, isn't already about a proclivity to violence, right? And so I think that those are really important. And in fact, you know, I'm working on a book right now about believability and women and thinking about sexual violence and how it is the case that women are so often not believed precisely because of the way in which the construction of gender has kind of characterized women as truth corrupters, while it's characterized men as truth tellers, you know, and that goes back for centuries. But there are exceptions, right? And so when are women believed? Often it is when white women accuse Black men of sexual violence,
Yeah.
because there already is this, this kind of cultural assumption that Black men have a proclivity towards violence, that they are naturally, violent. And so, I think that is, until we start really attacking the construction of masculinity, and not that a mass shooter who has a history of domestic violence and misogyny has mental health issues or is a lone wolf, and this was particularly striking to, I think, me and a lot of other people in the United States when you elect a president who doesn't even deny a tape where he is acknowledging and encouraging sexual assault, right? And then it's like, oh yeah, this is just locker room talk. This is just the way we are. That idea is really, really proving hard to shake, and so that is back to the Me Too issue. I mean, I think that it is in part about that, about these individual demons like Weinstein, and not about just like everyday kind of, practice or everyday understandings of masculinity. And it's also about who will be believed in Me Too. And that's, the whiteness of the Me Too movement is also a real factor in this.
There's so much more we could talk about here, but I want to touch on one other aspect that you bring up in the book, which admittedly I've never thought about before, but it really hit me when I read it, which is the connection between development and marketization of female empowerment. And you give this really interesting example, I think, of Africade and how what seems to be driving there for you to donate to charity is that these women, they can become consumers, they can become entrepreneurs, and they can, be market agents. Why do you think that the discourse is made in this way? Why do you think this is picked out as the way we think people will be, nudged to donate? And does this like deny the women to be empowered agency before they receive help by the charity or by us?
I mean, it's a really big question. And I think that there's different, also, I don't want to characterize or generalize development discourse, as one thing, but I do think that more kind of neoliberal versions of development have looked at, kind of the ways, the different sort of family dynamics, community dynamics in marginalized and disenfranchised countries and nations, and thought, okay, so women are running a lot of this stuff, right? When women are really in charge of a lot of this stuff. And so a general effort of again, like a kind of a neoliberal development discourse began to target girls and education. It was also the case that girls weren't being educated, but the girls, educating girls became it wasn't about empowering them as girls. It was about empowering them as economic subjects, right? So this kind of corresponds with the microloan and microcredit industry that, again, is about building, neoliberal subjects, or trying to build neoliberal subjects through the process of development. It is why the head of the World Bank said gender equality is good economics, right? I mean, it's, and so I think that, to think about girls as I say this in the book, as like the girls in the global South as the harbinger for change, and focusing efforts on them is also about, we need to recognize what is also the kind of goal of that, which is about capitalism. It is about neoliberalism. It's not about empowerment necessarily because you are female, right? It is about empowerment as an economic subject. We want these girls to become better economic subjects so that they can contribute to capitalism, that they can contribute to neoliberalism in this way. And I think that, again, this is not a general statement about development discourse, but if you look at different kind of institutions, you really see that target that is about notions of imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism. And those become the kind of logics of, that undergird empowerment there. And that I think we need to be critical of.
So maybe the last question I want to ask then is, so we've said a lot of critical things, right, about popular feminism and commodification and development just now. And, we've said that it's really restrictive. There's not a lot of angry women or focus on community. It's very male friendly. So is there still power in this feminism? Is it still able to achieve some of the goals of the maybe more radical types of feminism, which don't make it into the popular sphere? What can it inspire change nevertheless?
Yeah, I mean, it is the big question, right? And I think that one of the things, I have to remind myself of this a lot. One of the things that we need to really have when we're thinking about this is patience, right? I mean, the difference in the last 10 years between the sort of acceptance of any kind of feminism in a public and cultural context, it's astounding, right? That means something. Public awareness means something. And the fact that corporations and institutions and governments capitalize on that public awareness and turn a kind of commodified feminism into something that benefits them and not actually gender equality or gender construction is something that we need to be critical of. But does that mean that we, kind of throw up our hands and say, this is never going to work? I don't think so. I mean, the reason why I'm motivated to continue writing about this stuff and researching this is because I feel like there's ways in which we can think about it and practice it in a way that benefits, kind of not a capitalist system, but benefits a gender system, and think about what it means to actually sever feminism from capitalism and what that might look like and how that might look like. And so I think, to kind of go back to your very first question, there isn't one feminism, right? There's lots of different kinds of feminism. And the fact that a happy neoliberal feminism may be the most visible in the current moment doesn't mean it's always going to be the most visible. And you can see pushes against it all the time. And so our focus, I think, should be on those pushes against it, rather than what the latest corporation to adopt a gender equality program, or a diversity program into the logics of capitalism. We should critique that, but we should also make sure that we recognize that what this means, that corporations are taking notice, is that it has become much more visible and important and significant cultural movement. Otherwise, corporations would not care. So they care about this. They're exploiting it. They're capitalizing on it. We could do something different, right? And so that's kind of, so yes, I think there is definitely different ways for us to think about this. And I think lots of people are. And I think that you mentioned about anger, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of, women who have written books about anger, Brittany Cooper, Rebecca Traister, Chamali. I mean, they've become bestsellers. People are like, finally, like we can think about anger. I mean, Audre Lorde's quote is misused and appropriated and misunderstood in all sorts of ways. But the uses of anger is something that I think is really mobilizing. And so that's what I'm kind of thinking about, how, in terms of a movement, that's the direction I think could be a very fruitful one.
I think that's a good note to end on, I would say. Thanks so much for an extremely interesting conversation, which I think is just right on the nerve of the time. And thanks so much for making the time to come here.
Yeah, no, it was great to talk to you, and thanks for inviting me. And the podcast is a great idea, I think.